That very Christmas night, as the snow fell thick and the streets were left with only a few dim yellow lights, Mr. Donovan witnessed something he would never forget. Mara, his young cleaning lady, quietly bent down and placed her last $20 into the hand of a homeless woman, shivering in the cold with her small child. No hesitation, no expectation of gratitude. She simply gave. The sight stopped him in his tracks. Someone who had almost nothing had just given more than a millionaire like him ever had. That moment opened the door to this entire story. Before that Christmas night, Mara was just a name on the cleaning staff list sent to Donovan's house every week by a service company. But to her, life was far more complicated and exhausting. Mara was in her mid-20s, slim, with a bright face and eyes that always held a bit of warmth, even in the coldest days of winter. She lived in a small town where people still turned off their lights early and Christmas tree trucks stood motionless along the roadside. At the end of the year, the cold crept into every apartment. Mara lived in an old studio at the end of the hallway, with walls so thin she could hear the wind sweep through the corridor every night. The rent had once been manageable, but when winter came, the heating bill doubled. Her income as a cleaning lady wasn't much, so she had to calculate every little expense with care. Even so, Mara kept her smile, as if she believed that no matter how hard life got, it always had its reasons. Mara didn't have family nearby. Her parents passed away when she was young, and her relatives were scattered everywhere. She had lived independently for a long time, used to not asking anyone for help, and she never wanted to become a burden to anyone. But even though she was on her own, she never let loneliness turn her cold. Every morning, when she stepped out of her tiny apartment, Mara took a deep breath and told herself, "Come on, today will be okay." Her weekly work at Mr. Donovan's house had become part of her routine. The house was large, modern, and so quiet that sometimes Mara could hear the heater running steady in the background. Donovan was rarely home when she worked, and if he was, he only walked past with a slight nod. To him, Mara was probably just part of the service he paid for. But to Mara, respect was something she always carried. She never opened drawers on her own, never touched anything that wasn't on her task list. She cleaned every surface, every corner, with a level of care that was hard to find. One of Mara's small habits, something almost no one knew, was that she sometimes left little notes on a sticky pad in the corner of the kitchen counter. Just simple lines like, "Hope you have a good day," or "Wishing you a peaceful week." She never knew if Donovan noticed them, but every time she wrote one, Mara felt like she was planting a bit of kindness inside that quiet house. Many people think the poor tend to be selfish because they have to look out for themselves first. But Mara was the opposite. She once split her last sandwich with a young newspaper boy rushing through the cold. She once helped an elderly woman carry heavy bags without worrying that she would miss her bus. People sometimes asked why she was so kind, and Mara just smiled and said, "Because I know what it feels like to need someone's help." The night before Christmas, Mara worked the last shift. Donovan's house was darker than usual, so he was probably at some party. Mara turned on the living room lights and began cleaning piece by piece. The scent of holiday candles drifted softly through the space. Snow outside the yard kept falling non-stop. Even though she was tired, Mara worked with her usual patience, not missing a single detail. When she finished her work, she looked around one more time and turned off all the lights, leaving only the small warm one in the foyer, like she always did. She wrapped her scarf, pulled her coat zipper up to her neck, and stepped outside. The cold hit her face and made her shiver a little, but she still smiled. She knew she had nothing special planned for this Christmas. She would probably just go home, eat a bowl of hot soup, watch an old movie, and go to bed early. But Mara was content. To her, a peaceful day like that was enough. The moment Mara closed the door behind her and stepped into the winter night, set off a chain of events she never could have imagined. But right then, in her mind, there was only one thing: ending the last shift of the year with the best spirit she could hold on to. When Mara closed Donovan's door and stepped into the cold night, somewhere else in town, Donovan's world was moving to a rhythm completely different from hers. If Mara's life revolved around bills to pay and long work days where she tried to keep a smile, Donovan lived in a space so large that even he sometimes felt it was too quiet. But that silence was familiar, almost something he had trained himself to accept over the years. Donovan was a man in his 40s, successful to the point where people rarely mentioned his name without talking about high-rise buildings or major deals. In the real estate world, he was seen as the model of discipline and long-term vision. But the more successful he became, the more he withdrew. Keeping to himself had become a steady habit, not because he had anything to hide, but because he simply wasn't used to sharing his feelings with anyone. Donovan had lived by a simple rule for a long time. If something could be solved with money, then let money solve it. He was used to sending gifts instead of checking in, adding an extra allowance instead of apologizing, buying whatever he needed without having to talk much. He was practical to the point of feeling cold, and most people around him saw that as a natural part of who he was. With Mara, things were exactly the same. They had never really talked. If Donovan walked by and saw her working, he gave a small nod. Mara returned a polite smile, then kept going. It wasn't that they disrespected each other. It was that an invisible distance existed between them, like the gap between the two worlds they lived in. Mara saw Donovan as the homeowner she had to serve with proper standards. Donovan saw Mara as part of the service he paid for every month, polite, distant, clear. And that distance made the contrast between their lives even clearer. Donovan was wealthy far beyond what he even cared to acknowledge. He had a big house, nice cars, and parties full of people eager to talk to him. But the more material things he had, the emptier his emotions became. He went to work every day like a well-oiled machine, never off track. Mara, on the other hand, even while counting every dollar, carried a warmth that Donovan couldn't begin to understand. It wasn't loud, but you could see it in the way she treated anyone she met. Despite the gap between them, Donovan noticed Mara more than he ever admitted. Those brief interruptions in his routine made him aware of the difference in her. He had seen her work in silence, never complaining even when handling tasks most people would find annoying. He had seen her fix small details no one asked her to fix. She did everything naturally, as if carefulness was a standard she set for herself. Sometimes when walking past the kitchen, Donovan caught a glimpse of the little notes Mara left behind. But he only glanced at them and let them sit there, assuming it was just a professionally polite habit that many service workers had. He never thought any deeper about it, never imagined that those notes weren't part of her job, but were Mara's way of adding a bit of warmth to a house that was always too quiet. Christmas didn't mean much to Donovan. His friends usually hosted fancy parties where everyone wore their best outfits and traded the same familiar small talk. He was invited every year, and every year he went, not because he enjoyed it, but because it was something someone of his social standing was supposed to do. The smile on his face at those parties was always just enough, not too friendly, but not cold either. He blended into the lively atmosphere simply by being there, while his mind drifted somewhere else. In the moments when he stood in the middle of all the loud laughter, Donovan sometimes wondered what he was missing. He could buy anything, yet he still couldn't find something to fill the quiet emptiness sitting right in his chest, an emptiness he never talked about and couldn't explain. It was just there, no matter how successful or wealthy he became. That night, when the last pre-Christmas party ended, Donovan left earlier than usual. He stepped outside and tightened his coat as the cold wind hit his face. The streets were quieter than normal, snow falling thick and turning the walkway white. He opened his car door, sat inside, and took a long breath, as if he were trying to shake off the heavy feeling that had clung to him all evening. Without turning on the radio or calling anyone, Donovan drove in silence. Streetlights slid across the car windows in blurry streaks, and his thoughts felt as heavy as the winter sky. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for out there, only that there was an uncomfortable, empty note in his heart. The cold night stretched along every road he passed, and Donovan just kept driving, leaving behind the loud laughter of a party he had never truly belonged to. While he left the party with a heavy heart and drove through snow-covered streets, somewhere else in town, Mara was finishing her last shift of the year. Both of them were moving through the freezing Christmas night, unaware that just minutes later, they would witness a moment that would change everything. Mara stepped out of the big house after locking the door carefully. The darkness was deeper than she expected, and even though the streetlights were on, the space between the houses was covered in a thick, quiet stillness. Snow kept falling, the flakes landing on her hair and melting instantly. Mara pulled her scarf tight around her neck, took a deep breath, and started walking toward the bus stop. She knew she would have to wait a while because everything slowed down on Christmas, but she still chose to walk instead of calling a ride, because the last $20 in her wallet had to be saved for the days ahead. The streets were almost empty. Only a few small shops were still open, their strings of lights adding a bit of warmth to the biting cold. Mara walked slowly past a narrow corner. Right there, she saw something that made her feet stop on instinct. A woman was curled up against the wall, wrapped in a thin coat that didn't stand a chance against the cold. Next to her was a boy around 8 or 9, his face red from the freezing air, his tiny hands trying to find warmth inside an old scarf. They had nothing but a small bag and a piece of cardboard to sit on. No one noticed them. And no one stopped. The wind picked up, making the boys shiver even harder. Mara felt her chest tighten. She stopped, stepped back half a pace, and stood there for a few seconds as if pulled out of a different thought entirely. She reached into her coat pocket, then pulled her hand back as if she were hesitating. Mara knew she had exactly one $20 bill left in her wallet. That bill was supposed to carry her through the entire next week. No more, no less. The cold slapped her face, but it was the tight ache in her chest that made it hard to breathe. She looked at the mother and child, then down at her own shoes, then toward the road ahead. She knew that if she kept walking, those trembling eyes would haunt her for a week. Maybe longer, and her heart wouldn't let that happen. Mara took a breath, unzipped her bag, and pulled out the bill. The paper had softened from being used so many times, but to her it was still worth a lot. A whole lot. She walked closer, lowering herself a bit so she wouldn't seem threatening to the woman already curled up in fear. The woman looked up, her eyes caught between caution and desperation. Mara didn't speak with pity. She never used that tone, because she knew how much it hurt to be seen that way. She simply placed the $20 in the woman's hand, her skin so cold it felt like ice. Mara smiled, simple and sincere. "Wishing you a warmer night," she said softly, her voice trembling a little from the cold and the emotion rising in her. The woman opened her mouth as if to say something, but Mara didn't let her get the words out. She turned away quickly, partly because she felt shy about being thanked too deeply, partly because she knew she was about to cry. She didn't want anyone to see that. She took a few steps, trying to steady her breathing. Then behind her, the boy's voice rose, small but clear in the quiet night. "Merry Christmas." That trembling little voice hit Mara's back like a gentle touch that sank straight into her heart. She turned for a second, smiled at the boy, and said nothing more. Then she kept walking, feeling lighter than the snowflakes landing on her coat. She knew she had just given away her last bit of money, but it felt like she had received something far more valuable. Mara had no idea that just across the street, a black SUV had come to a stop. Inside, Donovan sat frozen behind the wheel. He had happened to drive past that corner, happened to slow down when he saw someone standing near the wall, and never expected that person to be Mara. He watched everything from start to finish. Every gesture, every word, every emotion hidden in the way she turned away so quickly. Donovan's eyes widened a little more with each passing second. If it had been someone else, he might have thought it was just a simple act of kindness. But coming from Mara, someone he knew was struggling, it didn't feel small at all. It felt like a piece of who she was, a piece he had never seen, a piece he didn't realize still existed in this world. In that moment, Donovan's emotions rose like a heavy wave. Shock came first, sharp and undeniable. Then shame followed, because he realized he had never given in that way. And as the image of Mara bending down and placing that bill into a freezing hand replayed in his mind, Donovan felt something tighten deep inside his chest. A mix of regret and emotion he hadn't felt in years. Mara had already walked away, but Donovan still couldn't move. His hands rested on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the spot where she had stood. The wind nudged the strands of holiday lights in the distance, and snow kept falling. But to Donovan, the world seemed frozen. He sat in the car for a long time, long enough for the windows to fog up from his breath. But Donovan didn't care. Something about that moment held him in place. He couldn't drive away. He couldn't turn from the truth that had just been laid bare before him. And in the silence of Christmas night, he sat there staring at the empty space where Mara had been, his heart heavier and deeper than at any lavish party he had ever attended. That moment stayed sharp in Donovan's mind, even as he finally put his hand on the gear shift and drove on. The road ahead blurred under the falling snow, but what truly pulled his focus away wasn't the weather. It was the image of Mara bending down, gently placing that $20 into the hand of a trembling woman. Even though he had left that corner behind, it felt as if the scene was running alongside his car, refusing to let him go for even a second. Streetlights slid past the windows in long streaks, but Donovan barely noticed. His thoughts were locked on a moment he couldn't explain. Why could someone living as hard as Mara give so easily? Why didn't she hesitate the way he always did when it came to anything involving emotion or people? And when had he become the kind of person who measured everything so carefully, even when he had more than enough to help someone? The car turned onto a quieter street, and with every meter he passed, Donovan felt a strange emptiness spreading through his chest. He wasn't used to this feeling. It was too real, too close, and impossible to push away by turning on the radio or shifting his mind to work. It felt like someone had switched on a light in a dark corner he had ignored for years. Donovan wondered, when had he forgotten how to feel empathy? Maybe it happened when he first started becoming successful, when he began shielding his heart as if he were afraid someone might see the softer parts of him. He couldn't even remember the last time he genuinely helped someone who had nothing to do with him. Because for a long time, he had only helped with money, not with actual care. An old memory rose without warning. Back then, Donovan had been a young man working every odd job he could find just to pay for a small rented room. That winter had been just as cold as this one, and he once stood shivering at a bus stop with a torn bag in his hand. A stranger, an older man, had given him a scarf and a few dollars so he could buy a hot meal. Just a small act, but it helped Donovan survive one of the hardest moments of his life. He had promised himself that one day, if he ever had the means, he would do the same for someone else. But now Donovan realized that after he became successful, he let that promise sink beneath piles of deals, contracts, and empty social events. He had forgotten it. Completely. Forgotten it so deeply that if he hadn't seen Mara's act tonight, he might never have remembered at all. The emotions rose like a breaking wave. The first was shame. Shame that he was so wealthy yet couldn't measure up to a young woman who was barely getting by. Shame that he had lost the kindness he once took pride in. Then came regret, tightening inside him until he had to loosen his grip on the wheel just to catch his breath. And finally, there was emotion itself, a rare feeling he thought had dried up long ago. Donovan realized he had lived too long in coldness. He had built a shell around himself so thick that he could no longer feel the simplest things. He hadn't only grown older, he had grown harder. And when he thought about Mara, someone who had so little, doing something he himself hadn't managed to do, Donovan suddenly understood that he owed the world something. Something he had forgotten to return for far too long. The car went a little farther before Donovan turned on his signal and pulled over. He placed both hands on the wheel and lowered his head slightly. Not to rest, but to admit that his life needed to change. Not tomorrow, not after the holidays. Right now. He didn't want his gift to Mara to be the usual kind of bonus. Not a little extra in her paycheck, not a polite thank you, and not some expensive but meaningless present. Donovan wanted to do something that truly mattered. Something that could make her future better. Something that could change her life in the way she deserved. That thought made his heart beat faster. Not from fear, but from something that felt like the first real sense of Christmas he had felt in years. For the first time in a long time, he felt alive. Truly alive. When he got home, Donovan didn't go to his bedroom right away. He took off his coat, set his keys on the table, then sat down, leaning his forehead into his hand. The big house was as quiet as always, but this time, the silence made him think instead of avoid. He opened his laptop, grabbed a pen and some paper, then set them back down. There was no formula for this, no template he could copy. It had to come from something real. He stayed up the whole night, not because he was worried, but because for the first time in his life, Christmas felt like it actually meant something. He thought about what Mara had done, thought about what he had lived through, and thought about what he could do to give back the very thing she had unknowingly taught him. Unconditional kindness. As the first light of morning crept in, Donovan looked up and knew he had made his decision. A decision he himself had never imagined before. A clear plan began to form, and it made his heart slow for a moment. as if he were about to do the most important thing he had done in years. And in the house, still carrying the cold scent of the winter night, Donovan prepared for a plan he never thought he would ever be capable of making. After a sleepless night of thinking, Donovan had barely closed his eyes, yet his mind felt clearer in a strange new way. For years he had started every morning with a long list of tasks and rushed phone calls, but today he had only one thing in his head, and that alone was enough to make him get up earlier than usual, pour himself a cup of warm water, and sit quietly as he waited for Mara's familiar knock at the door. At that same moment, Mara was wrapping her scarf and checking her small bag before leaving her apartment. She had no idea what had gone on in Donovan's mind the night before. To her, today was just another normal workday. She also knew it was the day after Christmas, and big houses were often messier during the holidays. Mara prepared herself for a long, cold shift, but she still kept her usual bright spirit. When Mara rang the doorbell, Donovan was already waiting in the foyer. That alone made her pause for a second. He had never waited like that before. Normally, she would enter when the door unlocked automatically, and if Donovan happened to be home, he would just give her a small nod before heading upstairs. But today, his expression was different. There was something softer in his eyes, something sincere that Mara had never seen. "Good morning," she said quietly. "Good morning, Mara. Today, I'd like to talk with you for a moment," Donovan replied. Just one simple sentence, but it felt strange to Mara. Still, she nodded out of reflex. Donovan led her into his office, a room he usually used only for meetings or signing contracts. Mara stood near the door, her hand gripping the strap of her bag as if trying to keep herself in the most polite posture possible. Donovan turned to her, took a small breath to gather himself, but when he spoke, his voice was calm and sincere. "Last night, I saw what you did," he said. Mara stiffened. She wasn't prepared for that. She never thought anyone would witness her small act. For a moment, she felt a bit embarrassed, but Donovan continued before she could respond. "I know. That $20 wasn't extra money for you," he said, his voice dropping. "But you still gave it away, without hesitation." Mara lowered her head, a little flustered. "I just did what I thought was right." Donovan looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "That's exactly what made me think. And I realized, maybe I've lived too long forgetting what kindness really means." The room felt warmer, even though snow was still falling outside. Donovan placed his hand on the edge of the desk, standing a little straighter as if he wanted to face his own feelings without hiding. "Mara, I want to help you," he said firmly. "Not a casual bonus, not just because of last night, but because you deserve it." Mara lifted her head, eyes wide. I'm not sure I understand." Donovan raised a hand gently, reassuring her. "I've prepared a few things, and I want you to hear all of them before you say no." He listed each one, his voice calm but full of resolve. "First, I'm giving you a significant raise. Not a small percentage, a real increase that will actually make your life easier." Mara flinched slightly from surprise. "Second, I'm going to cover your rent for an entire year. You won't have to worry about that until the end of next year." Mara's mouth parted slightly as if she wanted to speak, but no words came out. "And lastly," Donovan said slowly, "if you want to change your future, learn a trade, or go back to school, I'll pay for everything, whatever you choose." The room fell completely silent. Mara looked at Donovan as if she wasn't sure any of this was real. Her hands trembled, and she had to grip the strap of her bag to steady herself. But the emotions rose too fast, and she couldn't hold them in anymore. She burst into tears. Not loud crying, just quiet tears rolling down her cheeks, filled with relief and gratitude. Mara lifted her hand to cover her mouth, trying to control her shaking breaths. "I'm sorry. It's just," she stammered. Donovan took a small step forward, his voice softer than ever. "Mara," he said, "last night you reminded me what kindness really looks like." Those words touched something deep in Mara's heart. She had never imagined that her small action would make someone think so much, even less that a successful man like Donovan would see that in her. The air in the room felt warm enough that Mara could swear the lights above her were brighter. There was no gap between two worlds anymore, no invisible distance. Just two people, one who gave kindness with what she had, and one who finally found the goodness he had lost. Mara wiped her tears and tried to smile. "Thank you. I don't know what to say, really." "You don't have to say anything," Donovan replied. "Use this opportunity however you want. I'll take care of the rest." A soft silence passed between them. Not awkward, not forced, just a rare stillness in both of their lives. That day, Mara went to work with a completely different feeling, not because of the big gift, but because she felt seen, valued, acknowledged in the deepest way. The story closes with the message both Donovan and Mara learned on that winter night. Sometimes the person with the least is the one who teaches the richest, the greatest lesson. And real kindness never needs to be loud. It just needs to be done at the right moment, in the right way, with a heart that isn't counting anything. So do you believe that one small act can change a person? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for listening to the story.